when we kind of think about these, like, we kind of have this call out that's towards the outside. And I think, like in just one of the last weeks, we were kind of getting into a discussion about like, where and how we want people to direct energy. And I'm thinking, kind of reflecting on like looking at the CSCKEV list and like how we know initial access is happening, but also just the fact that like, um, nothing really, like, all bad things have to start with some form of initial access. And it seems like, I mean, just so much like what we just talked about today, right? It's just like NPM, like the Stealer ecosystem, things like ClickFix and like the evolution of ways that attackers are gaining that initial foothold into environments. Um, like I'm excited to talk about this mainly just because it feels like so important that that people direct energy towards initial access, which is not to say that you shouldn't worry about the rest. Thanks everyone for being here, as always. I'm Keith, and I think those of you who have been here any number of times may recognize Harrison. Harrison, I think it was August-ish when you were on the last time. Is that right?
I believe so. Yeah, we were talking about OAuth
Yep.
back then. Yeah.
Not too recent past. So we'll kind of dig into I'd say like a certainly a related topic today, which will be fun. So we've got a good bit to cover. So like we're gonna dig in here. We have a couple quick news items that we aren't going to spend much time on, but do want to call attention to. If you have any questions related to these, I think particularly for folks in the audience, like we're going to cover I'd say like this broader theme, but like of supply chain attacks here in a few weeks. So as we're going through these, if there's anything you want us to cover, today we'll answer questions if we can. But in particular, we're going to cover like both of these kind of like this broader supply chain topic when we cover Intel Insights in a couple weeks. So want to hit this one first. This has been fascinating. We were just chatting about this a few minutes ago. So Shai-Halud 2.0, the second coming, as it were. So this has been like, and so this is, I think, keeping in what is now kind of like a bi-weekly cadence of just talking through like supply chain attacks, particularly relating to like open source projects. And most of the ones we've covered that have been really high profile have been NPM based. So not going to go through like this threat or this, this incident or set of incidents in detail. Want to direct everyone first to just the resources that we've tossed over there. I'd say like the Wiz blog, if you're interested in getting caught up on this, seems to be the best place to start. They've done a great job of kind of like, referencing the original Akito research. Um, Akito was the firm that broke the story, but this is Wiz did a really great roundup on like, how this thing started, the evolution of it from like the original Shai-Halud to this, like the second wave, what's the same and what's different. So I think this in particular, though, we're like very actively handling this. I think, series of like just, kind of managing and keeping our eye on this incident overall, as we're finding it in customer environments. So like, Harrison, wanted to pick your brain real quick just to share with people pretty tactically. Like we are seeing this, if we're seeing it, like it's bypassing, all of the major like endpoint controls in particular, right? And this is a little bit of a thorny problem. So like, if you could summarize for folks, like what we're seeing, and from a threat detection standpoint, I think that would be super helpful.
Sure. So a couple of things we're seeing is, of course, we're seeing the truffle hog executions. Those happen a lot with this one as it goes to gather those credentials. We're seeing a lot of the Shai-Halud within the command line, attempts to, mess with Docker as well, and, just looting the tokens and things like that in general. A couple of the things that seem to have been helping with this thing spread so much are, you have developers that are working on some unmanaged endpoints. Maybe they want their, Jenkins runner or something to run just a little bit faster, so it might not have EDR on it. Or they're working from, their own laptops and in their own dev environments at home. And of course, those are unmanaged too. So those can help things slip through the cracks. Another thing, if you're just kind of generally interested, that you can look in GitHub for, of all places, is if you just look for this Shai-Halud, the second coming command line, you can actually see some of the different exposures within GitHub. And so from all the various repositories. But yeah, it's been very interesting.
There was a unique call out in the Wiz blog that I caught, and I haven't had a chance to go through like all of the material, but I think the that one mentioning GitHub, it's kind of interesting in that like you really have to do some looking to find out if you were a victim. And it's interesting just like understanding like how the automation on the adversary side is like exfiltrating the credentials and like where those are going. It's super, it's like it's effectively, like a compromised account from victim A might be the place where compromised account information from victim B gets published, et cetera. And it just seems like, yeah, that's like a fascinating and somewhat thorny like little web there. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so I don't know, encourage everyone to take a look at that. Again, tons of good information in both of those resources that we posted over there. But yeah, again, we are super actively managing this, and I think we're probably going to focus almost exclusively on this when we go through our monthly Intel Insights. I think this might be a good one for probably like that kind of smell, and maybe a good overtime episode coming because it feels like there's a ton to dig into here from like a preventative standpoint and mitigation standpoint. So. Other thing we'll cover real quick is this StealC V2 campaign. And so we've like in the same vein as we seem to not be able to escape talking about supply chain attacks. We also can't escape talking about Stealers. Those have been like at the very top of the list in terms of prevalence for threats we've seen. StealC in particular, we've covered before. As it is an interesting one where this is like a little bit almost, somewhat of a supply chain issue, just in a different way, right? So like these files are being like placed in repositories, like unwittingly getting run, and then Stealers doing Stealer things. So like, the payload itself is not super unique, but I think that's been another recurring theme is that like there's just the ingenuity behind gaining initial execution on an endpoint to get to the point where otherwise commodity payloads like Stealers are being executed. I put this right up there with click fix and other things, right? It's just like it's very much a whack-a-mole problem trying to get this stuff like to prevent this stuff from landing. Um, and I think the headline here is that I think we're just seeing that continued evolution of ways to gain execution or gain an initial foothold in an environment. And we focused a lot on social engineering lately. Um, and I kind of lumped this in the supply chain side because it's a, very similar tactic, right? Which is just, implanting or backdooring something that's already there and that people use and trust. So, um, and I'd say like maybe a great segue into like what Harrison's here to talk us through today. And so that's just how to layer up defenses. And I think this may be like no better time to talk through that than now, because I think, when just, those examples you laid out of like how we're finding these things that are like bypassing controls, right? Which I think is, job number one for security operations, right? Is there's like a situational awareness aspect of it. But the first thing we have to do is find like the incidents and the things that have slipped through the cracks, and just really trying to get a little bit prescriptive and help folks focus when they think about like, which layers are probably going to give them like the most bang for their buck. So I'm gonna turn it over to you, Hen. Where'd you like to start?
Um, so sure, if we'll just start on the next slide here, we're just going to quickly cover, what is, defense in depth, right? And so a lot of y'all are already familiar with this, but yep, you have your perimeter, your network, endpoint, you have your applications and data, and you know what? We need security on all of these different layers in order to be successful as cybersecurity individuals. And so, some of the things that I see a lot of the time with, when an incident gets bad is I'll see, hey, we have great, endpoint security, but we're not really minding on our, or we're not really looking into our network security, or maybe our identity security. Maybe we have like hundreds of Kerber roastable accounts with our environment. And so there's still a lot that's really accessible, even though you can see something running on an endpoint. Um, and so, which is why we need these layered defenses, because not just one tactic works 100% of the time, unfortunately. So if we're talking about our perimeter, of course, we're going to talk about our boundaries between ourselves and the rest of the world, right? And so you need your face masks or your balaclava or whatever you use to go outside into the snow, in order to keep that barrier um, between you and everything else. Um, when it comes to those perimeters, I think something to bring up is that if you leave a back door for yourself, well, if I'm a bad guy, that could be a back door for me too. So it's just something to kind of think about. Um, and then, of course, what might run through all of this are your identities, proving who you are. You're authorized to do what it is that you're going to do, those sorts of things. We spend a lot of resources in cybersecurity protecting who we are and what it is that we do. Um, and then our network, I see a lot of the plum pudding model, as I like to put it, if you're familiar with, the chemistry, to where, you have just a whole bunch of endpoints, you have a flat network, and everything can kind of access everything. When you have things like switch access control lists and other things that you can do to kind of help segment what can talk to what. Um, and then, of course, you have your endpoint security, which, I'm going to say we as Red Canary are great at, to defend the actual endpoints themselves and what those users are doing on them and what they're installing. You have your application security, some of those SaaS solutions, OAuth apps, and the like. And then, of course, your DLP and data security. Who are you sharing and what are you sharing across that board?
So, and when we kind of think about these, like, we kind of have this call out that's towards the outside. And I think, like just one of the last weeks, we were kind of getting into a discussion about like, where and how we want people to direct energy. And I'm thinking, kind of reflecting on like looking at the CISA-KEV list and like how we know initial access is happening, but also just the fact that like, um, nothing really, like, all bad things have to start with some form of initial access. And it seems like, I mean, just so much like what we just talked about today, right? It's just like NPM, like the Stealer ecosystem, things like ClickFix and like the evolution of ways that attackers are gaining that initial foothold into environments. Um, like I'm excited to talk about this mainly just because it feels like so important that that people direct energy towards initial access, which is not to say that you shouldn't worry about the rest, right? And like to wit, like, you know, there are diving saves happening hourly here right now, like finding things, endpoint and beyond. But yeah, I mean, like initial access is where all the innovation's happening on the adversary side, at least from my optic, right? It's like 90% of it. And it seems like the innovation, once you get past that, is kind of incremental.
Yeah,
Yep. Um,
it is.
so, when you're kind of talking, like thinking through like where folks fall short, like I don't know, like what's the story here? And like, I think, where's the unique pain point from your perspective in terms of like seeing like how incidents are happening and where we're responding?
Yeah, so the unique kind of perspective, yeah, of course, the perimeter and the network are the two major pain points that I'm seeing that people are falling short. Um, there are many controls that you can do with, something like your firewall, or if you have a Zscaler agent, things like that, that you can implement in order to get more control over what data goes in and what data comes out of your network and into your devices. Um, and so one of the
So
things that I've kind of seen is that you can mitigate a lot of these things by implementing them. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that, you're kind of obviously like, we're here just to talk about a layered approach, but like when you say like, just to push a little bit, like, when you say like where you're seeing like, that perimeter, like network in particular, so I'm just like what you're referring to there is like just to kind of segment this for people because we have focused a ton on like identity as an entry point into networks, but we also know just from public reporting, like CISA, folks like that, just like the vast majority, I'd say like, maybe that's not fair, but like a very significant number of these incidents are in particular exposed perimeter devices. So that's what you're talking about when you say like those are the ones that you've probably been like most hands-on with.
Yes. Yep. And those are the ones that seem to get the worst quickly, the fastest
Yeah.
lately.
What's the why behind that from your perspective?
Um, Overall, I'd say, and I think it might just be a lack of knowing what their perimeter can do to help mitigate a lot of the risk. Because you get a product and, some security providers, they say, yep, you're good to go. We'll see you next year when it's time to re-up on your license. But, talking about these things and learning about them, I think uh, can help.
Yeah. I would love to take this opportunity to jump on one of my favorite soapboxes, which is the tremendous irony in buying security products that actually worsen your overall security posture. And I think that is like, you're talking about like buy a Fortinet device or whatever and just fire and forget by sticking that thing out there and assuming you're safe. And I think there's like configuration aspects of that, but there's also just the daily blocking and tackling of just making sure that the thing is patched and that you're logging. And like I think, um, you say like, people not having an appreciation for what those can do. Um, I think there's maybe even like there's just an assumption that like that they're safe in general. And so like therefore
Hmm.
they just don't get looked at all. And so it's not even so much like, what is this thing capable of, but an even simpler or more unfortunate kind of approach to it, which is like this is a security device and it's safe and I don't need to pay the same level of attention to that I do to like my Okta logs or my EDR
Hmm.
logs. And I think it's a huge takeaway. And it is like I know we're going to get more into this in some specific examples, but um, whatever model you kind of choose to look at, I think that is, could just the big takeaway for me is always like how important it is. And like zero trust is a little bit buzzwordy, but I do think like those principles obviously like will take you far, right? So, all
Completely
right.
agree.
So, and let's dig into this because we've kind of already touched on it. So I think, we kind of got into this like exposed management console, which I think is like, where this umbrella of like things you put out there and assumed they were safe. Yes.
Yep, exactly. So one of the things that I, kind of saw a while ago is you see an exposed management console with um, on a firewall device, and with from the logs on that firewall, of course, you can't install an EDR on a firewall, unfortunately. But
You can collect the logs from it, right? Which
yeah,
is
exactly.
just, I mean, just to be super direct about that. So,
To be clear, yep, that's right. Um, but what we saw some brute force activity to that management console. We, kind of saw some exploit activity from what the logs suggested on that firewall, because that firewall was not completely updated. And inevitably, we saw a asset getting registered on that, firewall device, which they're using to get into their local network through VPN. And so then the adversary, once they had that VPN enabled device, they could just jump on the network and start, poking around and trying to laterally move. And inevitably, what they did was, we saw them get onto an endpoint and start installing an RMM, which is another thing that we see very commonly. Is that RMM installation. So that way somebody has a way back into these systems that they're getting initial access into. Um, and so this is something that we've seen, a couple times. Something that comes to mind, especially on that network perimeter to me, is were those sonic wall firewall vulnerabilities that we saw a while back, and those getting exploited frequently,
yep.
which seem very very topical. Um, but there were some things that we could do. So if we take this situation to kind of help mitigate some of this. So, you know, first off, I'm gonna beat the drum of SSL inspection, I think, until the day I die, and I will keep doing this. But SSL inspection is an awesome way to understand what's going out of and what's coming into devices, and kind of being able to um, tell what's going on through applications. And so by an application, we mean like that layer 7 application, right? And so if you have something like TeamViewer running on an endpoint, you could see within, any of these layer 7, network tools, you can see it say, oh yeah, I know what that is because that's TeamViewer. The TeamViewer packet looks like this, so we know it's TeamViewer. That's kind of high level how those seem to work. Um, but what you could do that's really cool with SSL inspection is you can make firewall rules to block specific applications or groups of applications. Like if you're looking at this previous incident, um, you have an RMM on a device, right? Um, One of the things that you could do is you could block all the RMMs except for the ones that you use by an application category of just remote monitoring, right? So you make your first, you'll want to make, of course, a shadow rule to do that, saying, hey, I need to figure out what I have in my environment before I just go and wide swath block everything, because otherwise you're going to have a bad time. and um, and then you can slowly and incrementally have those discussions with the rest of your IT teams and say, hey, do you guys use this RMM? Is this used regularly? What do you use it for? Maybe you can unify the org on which RMMs are in use. Um, and block all those different ones that you don't use. Then it's low management for you. You're not constantly adding another URL or another IP, and it's done by that category of application. So if you see it pop up, somebody installed something they shouldn't.
So this is neat. Like, just as you're talking through this, there are obviously like, particularly just even, you kind of talk about like shadow rules and then block rules. And I think, at every kind of step along the way, this is like, these are the same principles I think that like folks have been advocating for a long time when it comes to application control is the same thing, right? So like take that same principle, right? The example you're giving is at the network, but like continuing to apply that, kind of using that, layered defense model. Um, same principle as doing this like at the endpoint. Although I think, maybe
Mhm.
what you're describing may be more achievable for a lot of folks just because you don't like, even though you should certainly like, if, we want people to eventually get to the point where you're doing that same kind of like those proactive controls on devices themselves, saying only these things can run. And if it's not allowed, it just can't. And that is like really just such an effective like attack surface reduction or kind of like risk avoidance tool. But
Yeah,
that's like there's a lot of moving parts there, and obviously like that's a really tight coupling between like IT, every part of the business. And there's definitely a high support cost. So I don't know. I like that you're calling that out there, which is, take that same approach, which is like monitor and understand what you've got purely from a like a network traffic perspective, and then start to take those proactive steps there where it's, a little bit easier. It's a little bit, it's also a great catch-all, right? For like a
exactly.
inside.
Yeah. And you can tie identity to it a lot of the time. You can say
Yeah.
this person gets to talk to these devices. And so makes your whole life just a little bit easier.
Yeah, definitely. Like I think the conditional access stuff, like where those things are converging is awesome. So, very cool. And I think, you kind of already talked through or alluding now to like some of
Yeah,
that identity and access control stuff, which I think is like an awesome approach.
exactly. And then to kind of branch on off that even a little bit, get into your, so I'm kind of stealing this a little bit from when I messed around with OT a bit more, but the Purdue model, it, it it seems like something that might only apply to manufacturing spaces, but the core kind of a thought that I take out of it is, you have these devices that are super duper important. You know, maybe
But
you have
what is the
some
Purdue model, like
database.
big picture, just for folks that aren't familiar?
Yeah, and so it's a layered kind of way of thinking about network segmentation, right? And so you have like a DMZ, you know, in general. And then under that DMZ, you have like your IT zone, which, you know, you have your enterprise zone devices, you know, your run of the mill, like, oh, hey, maybe we have Joe from accounting on some laptop over here. And then below that, you have like your control plane, different your plant DMZ. I'm sorry. You have your plant DMZ, then you have your control, then you have maybe an HMI LAN, then you have controllers. But as you go down into these depths, you get more and more sensitive devices or more devices that are, you know, hey, if I even send a straight packet to it, it might croak on me. Um, and you do that to kind of, you know, keep bad guys off of things like a boiler system, where if they overpressurize it, you know, that thing explodes, which hurts people. Um, but you can take a similar kind of an approach when it comes to that enterprise zone, so to speak, within the Purdue model, where, you know, if you have a Oracle database, I'm just picking on Oracle right now, not whatever reason. Um, not everybody in the company needs access to that Oracle database to their day-to-day work. And not everybody needs, you know, specifically RDP access. Maybe they just need to use, you know, whatever brand of SQL to get to it. And so you can tighten down controls so that way you end up with some logical segmentation between those super important devices and the rest of the world. And when you do that, it can make pivoting within a network as an adversary very, very difficult because they have to figure those controls out as they go.
Yeah, that's and I'll say the thing I've been learning a lot more about, mainly from like a product perspective, and this is kind of just largely like, us getting, more involved with like the Zscaler too, is just like on like taking that all the way and just saying everything is on its own little network, and going back to kind of your firewall rules principle, like everyone's on their own network and can only talk to other things on the network if policy permits. And like I do think from a product perspective, it's neat seeing how much more practical that's become now than it was even a few years ago. So that's awesome. Love it.
That was a nightmare a few years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, for folks that, kind of have the vision and the understanding and the desire to go that route, that's an incredible tool.
Yep. And so finally, a couple more controls for this incident. Your PAM, right? Your privileged access management. A lot of them can auto rotate some passwords, you know, so if you have a privileged account anywhere, you know, you can automatically set those to reset those passwords for you and have kind of a checkout process for users when they want to use one of those accounts when they're in use, which can be very helpful. And then, of course, if you're patching a perimeter device, you know, this is one of the reasons why we have HA pairs, right? And so we can have one patching while the other one takes over the rest of operations. You get that automatic swap over during that time, so you know that that perimeter device still works, and you have your patching completed that way.
And, um, I'm going to jump ahead here just for like, in the interest of time, but I will say like, that HA thing's an interesting one because there's costs associated there. And so a lot of folks will say like, we don't have the time or like the cost to the resources to manage, multiple things and to kind of take that full HA approach. But um, I would say like, this is a great example of where like incident data will tell us that like the cost of downtime is, if you can only have one of those devices and can't go full HA, like the cost to take it down and patch it is almost certainly worth it compared to the alternative. So, um, and so you alluded before into like lack of SSL inspections. So maybe we'll move quickly through this one because I would like to make sure we kind of talk through the mitigations. But what's here that like that we haven't covered or you want to call out?
So what I would like to call out within this instance of a lack of SSL inspection is, maybe you're not blocking something, but a lot of the network tools for your perimeter are really, really good at identifying beaconing activity. It's not something that's very easy to see necessarily for an EDR on an endpoint. I say necessarily, but um, but your network endpoints are really, really good at it. And one of the things that really helps them be really, really good at it is that SSL inspection. And if you can't do it for your endpoint devices, I would implore you to do it on your servers, so you can see that happening there.
Yeah, and I think, kind of getting in, like, just jumping right ahead to like other preventative controls in that same vein. So like, responding to those logs, right, which I think we've just been talking about, which is like, ideally you could do things like patch and prevent, put strong configurations in place, but like just making sure that people are watching these things and doing something about anomalies is like super critical.
Yep, exactly.
Um, yeah, and so like on the maybe here, since we've got 1 minute left, like if you could call out the account hygiene side. So because I know this is where we've seen like, oh, these like bad people are like water for better or for worse. And so I know a lot of what we see is like just pockets of bad account hygiene policy exceptions. Like those are the Achilles heel in a lot of these cases.
Yes, they are. So for this one, I guess a major call out would be leveraging protected user groups within Active Directory. So that way you don't have administrative hashes just being kind of cached away on your endpoints would be great. And then disabling those administrative accounts when you don't need them. And of course, those change control processes to help with all of that. So you have your paper trail. If they're supposed to be doing it, they should be able to tell you they're supposed to be doing it.
I appreciate the call
Yeah.
outs. I think I know, gosh, just thinking back to like, like the Microsoft incidents around this time of year, a couple of years ago, like that account hygiene was like quite literally front and center there, where it was just grandfathered accounts that weren't subject to policies that would be in place out of the gate if you set the org up a month or a year later, right? Or today, for example. And so going back and policing those actively, super important.
Mhm.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, David, absolutely. Like in general, like cleaning up like Active Directory or any directory service is such a good call out. Um, I know we've been, huge proponents of stuff like Bloodhound and just being, just really taking the time to kind of audit and work through um, directory services in general. They are so incredibly complex. I feel like Active Directory is basically a Turing complete kind of like system unto itself. And like obviously like far more than just an authentication backend. So and we're at time now, but I will say, there was a question there. So Kevin was asking if we could talk a little bit more about protected user groups. So like we'll take this opportunity to use the overtime that we give ourselves at our own discretion. So Harrison, if you don't mind, could you just talk a little bit more about that? Like I'm not super familiar with that either.
Yes, and so I'm going to drop a link here to the Microsoft document because their docs are getting better and better.
Cool. So make sure you flip to oh yeah, there you
Yep,
go.
I got it. Yep, yep. Thank you, Chris. As well. But what this does is it will help you. It just helps keep credentials from being cached on an endpoint. And so if you are on a machine, a lot of times you can find within, SAM or somewhere else, you can find those credentials being cached somewhere, and you can use them to start laterally moving and do all kinds of things. And so what this is for Windows specifically, Windows devices, is it will help prevent that caching from happening. Because if you don't have that credential on your machine, then they can't use it. They can see that, oh yeah, maybe some account here existed, but they can't loot those credentials. And so this group tells Windows, don't cache those credentials in a nutshell.
I know I was typing also, but I wanted to give a +1 to Jacob's suggestion for the CA policy too, which is like another great example of those like positive types of controls where you can really just be like thoughtful and proactive and really prescriptive about what's possible at all. And then you don't have to worry quite so much about watching everything, looking for anomalies and trying to find things that are slipping through the cracks, just because that can be obviously like those are diving saves and in some ways they're our bread and butter, but like we would sure as heck like to do less of them, as would everyone, I think. So yeah, that like just thinking about the blast radius is a great way to characterize that, Jacob. Uh, Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. Thanks everyone for hanging out a few minutes late. And apologize we didn't have more time for questions and discussion. I think this kind of broke off late, but this is yeah, awesome topic. Harrison, like really appreciate you putting this together. Hopefully this is super helpful to everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, Key. Thanks for having me on here.
Yeah, thanks as
You
always
know.
for here. Thank you everyone, and thanks for your time, and we'll see you again next week. Cheers.